Welcome to How to Decorate from Ballard Designs, a weekly podcast all about the trials and triumphs of decorating and redecorating your home. I'm Caroline, I'm on the marketing team.
And I'm Taryn, and I'm a product designer.
I'm Liz, I head up the creative team.
We're your hosts. Join the expert team at Ballard Designs for tips, tricks, and tales from interior designers, stylists, and other talents in the design world.
Plus, we'll answer your decorating dilemmas at the end of each episode.
We love answering your questions, so don't forget to email us at podcast@ballarddesigns.net.
Now, on with the show.
Hi, listeners. Before we get to today's episode, wanted to let you know that my guest, Ben Pentreath, and I had a great conversation. We talked for way too long, though. So instead of cutting the episode down, we're just going to split it into two parts. So we'll have part one today, part two next Tuesday. Liz was under the weather and Taryn was in France. So it's just me and Ben talking about his book, An English Vision, though. He was lovely. I loved the conversation and I also loved his book. So let's get to the show.
Okay, our guest today is a major treat, architect and interior designer Ben Pentreath. His design work is expansive, spanning from small interior design projects to designing whole towns. He's been called the best country house architect in Britain. He's designed much of the town of Poundbury in partnership with the Duchy of Cornwall, as well as a new sustainable development in Scotland, Tornagrain.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
From townhouses in London to country houses and full developments across the UK, Ben's impressive work highlights the best of classic English architecture in a way that suits modern life, all of which he showcases in his new book, An English Vision, Traditional Architecture and Decoration for Today. Ben, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
I have to say that I read your book front to back, and then I could have just started all the way over because I enjoyed it so much. Just so insightful
really
and poignant in so many places. It seems like you were sort of coming to revelations while you were writing the book, you know, about simplicity and what makes a great structure and what makes it last.
Yeah.
I just thought that was so wonderful to read, I think, in today's world where you wonder why some things last and others are torn down and redone and
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, thank you. That's very kind. Yeah. I suppose in a way it's a distillation of a lot of things that I've been thinking about for a long time.
Sure.
To a certain extent, you don't really think too much, about what you're doing. And it's there's a whole strange thing about writing a book. There's a strange thing about writing a book anyway. Like, why are we doing it? What's it all about? But there's something even more strange about writing a book, which is all about your own work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a definite, ooh, that's a kind
Sure.
of funny moment. And a few people ask me from time to time, kind of, why are you doing this? And I was like, I don't know why I'm doing it. I sort of, about 5 years ago, I was asked to do it by Rizzoli, which was fantastic. They sort of got in touch. Obviously, they're a fantastic publisher to work with, so I was very excited. I'd done 2 books before, which had been well received a few years ago, but they were all about, some of my houses were in them, like my house in Dorset appears in all 3 in different guises. But those first 2 books were all about, basically about other people's houses, friends and people I knew a little bit, or houses I knew, buildings I knew, which I wanted to kind of weave together to tell a story about different themes of English decoration. And then, I had a big pause while I was actually getting on and working and doing lots of projects. And then, yes, as I say, about sort of 4 or 5 years ago now, Rizzoli got in touch and said, would I be interested in producing a book on our studio work? And I said, that sounds delightful. I'd love to, without really thinking very much about how much is involved, to be honest. There's a lot. It took a long time. But I had lots of excellent excuses as to kind of why I couldn't quite meet my deadlines. And,
sure, COVID, yeah.
I think all publishers are very familiar with authors dodging deadlines. I think it's just part of the industry. But one very sad moment for me was when my mum and dad both died within a few weeks, really, of one another. My mother died rather suddenly, very unexpectedly. But she was old. It was very sad. It was a great loss. But I had to spend a lot of time as you can imagine, then with my father, who was pretty distraught, and then we were all distraught, and then sort of literally not long after, like a few months after, my poor dad, I mean, basically died almost of a broken heart in a way. And so that was, I don't want to be in any way make light of things, but I can now because it's a while ago. But that was my first perfect get out of jail card with Rizzoli, my editor. And they said, I'm so sorry. Like, I've suffered quite a complicated trauma. And can I start again next year? And they were like, yes, that's fine. And then, you're right. You just mentioned COVID. So that turned up. Just as I was about to start a huge round of kind of traveling over and doing photography and all the rest of it, and really starting to do it. So then I called my editor, very long suffering, and I said, Philip, I just think we're really going to struggle to get access to kind of houses, and people don't want me and a photographer turning up at the moment, as you can, and we shouldn't really be turning up, as you can understand. And he just said, Ben, if your book is late, that is the least of my problems right now.
Right.
They were so then I would think,
that's a nice
yeah. So then I was given at least another year, and then it started to get a little bit more serious, and they were beginning to say, right, okay, time to start delivering material, and I was like, yes, and then I realized that I was trying to fit the whole thing into my kind of normal life and existence and work life. And that is quite busy. We've got about 40 people in the design studio here in London, in Bloomsbury. There's a big team of architects, master planning on the new towns and developments. And then we've got a fantastic team of interior designers. And then there's also just the whole administration and the running the practice and all of that. And so what I was finding was that I was setting aside time in my diary. I was just allocating a week here or a week there. I said, right, okay, I'm going to focus on the book then, so that I could just do everything else as per normal, kind of run my meetings, meet my clients, design the buildings, everything else. And that was all well and good, except that every single week that I picked to go to wherever the projects were to take photographs, almost without exception, it was just terrible weather those particular weeks, throughout the year. It was almost like I was jinxed. And it was just dull, flat light, kind of like storms blowing in, whatever, like just not ideal circumstance to really pull together kind of a lot of material. And so then I asked Philip for one more year, and he said, okay, but this time is the last time. So then finally, sort of over the course of last year and a little bit the year before, I was really making this into a really serious project, where I actually, the way that I managed to take all of the photographs over that period of time was just to say, this is like the trump card, which is going to kind of win any other, it's going to beat any other meeting, any other thing in my diary is going to be superseded by the book. If the weather is right in the north coast of Scotland or whatever it might be, I'm going to have to go. And so whenever we had a client, or I mean, sometimes new clients were quite surprised when I sort of said to them, I'd love to meet you, and I'm going to put a date in my diary, but I had a little note prepared saying that I was taking a sabbatical to write my book. And it was like, we're really happy to put things in the diary, but I might have to cancel at short notice, which I regularly did. But then the beauty was that because I hadn't actually got very much in my diary, I could immediately, it was actually a very liberating way to work, because I think we all get into a world where we get incredibly booked out. I think putting this podcast in our mutual diary is about 9 months ago or something, I seem to remember. So, so it was actually very, very freeing. But then I got into this process of just really thinking about, okay, what is this all about? And that was a challenging question. And it goes back to kind of, why did I want to write a book 5 years ago? I don't think I thought about it that much then. But as the thing took shape, and as it's a very unusual moment as an architectural designer, interior designer. It's a really wonderful moment to spend a concerted period of time not just thinking about the next project, which is normally what you're doing. You're normally on the next one, or kind of the current thing. What's it looking like? Blah, blah, blah. I was actually able to take it's a very rare moment to have a sort of pause a moment just to look around, to go back and revisit some houses and buildings and places that in some cases I hadn't been to for a number of years, actually to see how they're all settling in and bedding in and how people are living there, which is never the same as you entirely plan at the beginning. And then also, as you can imagine, there were a lot of car journeys or train journeys to get everywhere. And so that also gave you a lot of thinking time on the way back. What's it all about? And so you're right, it is actually a very personal book.
Maybe we could rewind a tiny bit. You can give everyone a little bit of a background, just our audience who might be unfamiliar with you, a little bit of your background.
Absolutely.
Because I especially loved in one section of the book, you talked about how someone told you when you were young that you could never be an architect. And
my careers master at school.
Yeah. So maybe kind of start with that a little bit and how you got into architecture and then interior design.
In English schools, there's very often sort of careers advisory. I don't know if you have that at home, but it's sort of where the careers master is, like, if I'm being mean, they're kind of like the one person in the school who's probably never done that much kind of exciting with their lives. But yeah, they're the people who are advising generations of people to going out into the world, what they can do and what they can't do. But obviously when you're 15 or 16 years old, if somebody says you can't do that, you sort of, I didn't entirely trust him, but I sort of trusted him. He was in a position of authority. The reality was that I was always in my whole life, I came from an art background, drawing, painting, writing. I've always loved writing. I've loved reading. I've loved old buildings. I've loved anything to do with the kind of the visual or the written world. And actually, he wasn't entirely wrong. Architecture, to a certain extent, is now. It's such a complicated world, architecture, but it is also a scientific and a mathematical and an engineering world. Obviously, thank goodness God created engineers, so I can work with very talented people who can make buildings stand up. And in a certain way, I like to design a building that actually isn't too hard to make it stand up, if you see what I mean. There are a lot of very contemporary buildings out there in the world where people kind of delight in doing things which, if you're staring at that building, you think this is completely impossible. How does this even work? Huge things which jut out over the hills or whatever. Those are always very visually exciting and intriguing, but it's kind of not really what I want to do anyway. But so I started out, as I say, kind of like from a very early age, being steered away from architecture as a degree study or as something to go through at university, and into the kind of the arts. And I ended up, I also had a history. I loved history at school when I was young. I still love history. In a way, the whole of our lives is about a dialogue with history and our place relative to the past and relative to the future. And that's, I suppose, one of the themes which kind of emerges through the book. I had a pretty unsuccessful moment where I was sent for an interview at Cambridge University to read history, and it was just completely disastrous because they knew I didn't really want to do it, and I knew that I didn't really want to do it. So it was just one of those things where we're like, what are we both doing here? Anyway, so that was that. So I ended up at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, the most beautiful city, one of the most beautiful cities in Europe. I don't know if you've been to Edinburgh. It's like this fantastic combination of an ancient medieval capital city of early medieval Scotland, and then in the beginning of the 18th century, in the mid 18th century, as the city had expanded and was getting incredibly overcrowded, it's sort of the city fathers decided that they had to build a whole massive extension to the north of the city of Edinburgh called the New Town, which is the most sensational kind of 18th century Georgian development, piece of town planning, one of the most amazing pieces of town planning anywhere in Europe, anywhere in the world. Wow. And it's and so as a student aged 18, I kind of found myself living in this incredible place, surrounded by incredible buildings, wonderful people, kind of like it was a mind-blowing, brilliant experience. Living in that wonderful city. which I love so much even today. And I was doing history of art and history of architecture, which was like perfect for me. And I was also doing practical painting and art in the Edinburgh College of Art. So it was an amazing degree. It was kind of a bit exhausting. So after a while, I gave up the art side on a sort of major basis, and I just concentrated on the history side. So then I'm about 21 years old, I guess, 22 at this stage, sort of faced with, I knew that I loved buildings. I knew that I loved old buildings. I was actually secretly kind of designing loads and loads and loads of new old looking buildings kind of it was a bit nerdy in my spare time, kind of. Everyone else was like out partying and getting drunk, and I was just drawing houses on my little drawing board in my bedroom. It's not quite true, but I was quite a lot. And actually, I think what I was doing was creating. I also had this very strong interest in interior design and decoration, and the history of design and history of interior decoration. And I think what I was doing in those days was drawing kind of pretend houses, which I could then have fun making pretend interior decoration for, furniture plans and all the sort of things that people do when they're, a bit nerdy like me, age 17
creative.
or 18 or 20, creatively nerdy. And so I knew that I had this strong passion for it all, but I couldn't see a way forward, and that was really going to suit. I think at that moment, there was a fantastic degree, it's still running, I believe, in a university in a city called York, which is called the Architectural Conservation degree. And a lot of people who had studied architectural history or art history were going into this world where you could then work for organizations like the National Trust or kind of building restoration organizations, looking after old buildings, restoring them and healing them. And it's a fantastic world. And I nearly went into it. And then in my last year at Edinburgh, I met a person who actually in my early life, I think everybody has these people in life or moments in life where people are just very influential, and I'm still great friends with him, Charles Morris, who became my first boss. In fact, I'm still really good friends with his whole family, and one of his daughters was staying with us in London last night, which was great. We see each other a lot, and so I met Charles. That's another long story, so I won't go into how, but it was great. Just one of those chances of fate that somebody put me in touch with him, and he came to see. He was giving a lecture in Edinburgh to a little club that we ran with some friends in the history of architecture department. And then I was showing him some of the drawings that I've been doing. And he was like, I don't think you should be going into the history of, architectural conservation. I think you should, I think you'd enjoy designing new buildings. And I think you should and could. And I was like, what? No one's ever said that to me before. Hence that little introduction in the start of my book, which you're right to pick up on. It's like, there I was. And when you're that sort of age, you don't know where life is going to take you. And sometimes it does take somebody to say, you can do anything you want in life. If you're, good at it and work hard and devoted to it, everything is possible. Even if you haven't at that specific moment done a degree in formal architecture.
Right.
So Charles very kindly offered me a little summer job in his office, and I said I'd love to come down, and I went to work for him for a month, and it was a fantastic studio. There were great people there. It was a very idyllic moment of my life, actually, really kind of I've got such strong and happy memories of that time. And then I was going off traveling with friends all over the place and seeing the world and all the rest of it, but it was just the most fantastic summer. And then at the end of that, something had obviously gone right, because he said, well, why don't you come back for Christmas for a month? And I was like, I've got a long holiday at Christmas. I'd love to do that. So I did. And that was beginning to get a little bit more serious. I was actually drawing things even after that early period of time. I was doing little drawings of things that were actually getting built. That was very exciting.
Yeah.
Like, wow, this is real. This could be real. And then at the end of that, Charles very kindly said, well, why don't you come and work here for a bit and do almost like actually how all architects in history actually learned architecture not in college or university, but as an apprentice, in an apprenticeship, basically. And so that's how I started. When I left Edinburgh, I had a fantastic 6 months when I went traveling with partly on my own, partly with friends, and we had an amazing time in Eastern Mediterranean and then Greece, Turkey, and then I had the most amazing time traveling down into Syria, which was like just one of the most mind-blowing moments of my life. Being in, sadly, it's all obviously now very some of those ancient Roman and ancient sites are now very sadly destroyed after the war. But that's a moment I will never forget, being in the Roman city of Palmyra on my own one night as the sun went down, like the only person there in the middle of this kind of 3,500-year-old place. It was incredible. And then I had a brilliant time traveling for a few months in India as well. And I came back a bit more grown up as a result of all of that, some of the crazy experiences I got up to. And I worked with Charles for not for that long, but for about 2.5 years in total. And I did, by then this was like a bug. I was addicted. This was going to be my life. I didn't know how it was going to end or what was going to happen or what was going to happen next. But I absolutely loved the whole process of designing and working with old buildings or designing new buildings. And Charles was he's a very comprehensive designer. He designs furniture and interiors for people, and he's got his own very distinctive language. So it was an amazing place to learn. After a while, I decided that I wanted to do actually more architectural studies. So I went to a fantastic, quite new architectural college, architectural school, which had been set up by the former Prince of Wales, now the King Charles, called the Prince of Wales's Institute of Architecture, which was based in London, in Regent's Park, in one of those beautiful big villas in Regent's Park, if anybody knows that part of London. And it was a mind-blowing experience. I mean, it was crazy. It was absolutely crazy. It was also quite chaotic and quite disorganized and so on. But actually, I think if you imagine what it must have been like being in the Bauhaus in 1920, that was probably pretty crazy and pretty chaotic as well, but amazing. So it was almost like the flip of that, because at that moment in the 90s, in the mid-1990s, all architectural education really almost exclusively in the whole of the United Kingdom, in most of Europe, in nearly all of America, apart from the University of Notre Dame, the architectural training was entirely modernist. It was completely a kind of modernist training, teaching architects how to be modernist architects. And you might have done a course in architectural history along the way, because that was perceived to be something people should know about. But you weren't taught how to design a classical molding or how to detail a sash window or kind of how to detail anything in traditional architecture. So there I was in this architectural college being taught all of that stuff and how to use old materials, and I mean, new old materials, but sort of ancient materials, timeless materials, and with fantastic tutors. And it was an amazing experience. It was, as I say, it was pretty crazy at times, but we all loved it. I had great colleagues on that course, and it was a fantastic experience. I went back to Norfolk to work with Charles for one more year, and then I have to be honest, I got itchy feet, and I was living in the most idyllic experience, which I have very, very, very few photographs of, and I can only really describe it. I was living in this ancient, tiny little cottage, which I'd sort of rented off a friend, and it was down a long track, kind of with one or two little houses going down, and it ended up sort of in this woods, and there at the end of the track was this little house, which I was living in.
Does sound like a movie.
It was kind of like being in a film. I had created with my landlady, Caro, who I was renting the house from. She came up every now and again. She lived in London. She was hardly there. I was there the whole time. And we sort of made this mad, crazy, huge garden. I really got into gardening. And, it's kind of weird, the days before the internet and phones and stuff like that. You actually had quite a lot of time on your hands. So I read lots of books and had lots of people to stay and painted, and like it was a very fantastic life. But actually, after a year or so, I was like, I need to see a life on a bigger stage. I'm living in a tiny village in the back of nowhere, and like it's idyllic, but it's almost like a sort of it was almost too good to be true, and it wasn't quite challenging enough. And through one of my contacts at the Prince of Wales's Institute of Architecture, I was put in touch with a couple of New York architects at the time, and this is in the sort of, I guess we're now in about 1997 or 98, who were looking for people to go and work for them. And I got in touch with one of them, who is Anne Fairfax and Salmons, who are one of the great New York classical architectural firms. And I said, hey, we had a phone call. I remember, again, the days where you couldn't just type into Google list,
Right.
tell me the kind of 15 architectural firms in New York or whatever. You just had to figure it out. You had to find it out. There was no book. There was no guidebook for any of this.
Right.
Anne and Richard were, as it happens, coming over to London for a week or two. They were coming on a trip. So we met, and we met up in London. And I had a few drawings and a little portfolio. Never really done a proper job interview before in my life, so I didn't really know what to bring. And they gave me a job. And then we had a horrible time waiting for my visa to arrive, but that finally arrived. And then I can remember the day specifically, Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1999, I arrived in New York.
Wow.
So that was a sort of game changer in my life, as you can imagine. Another little landmark. And I had the most wonderful time working with them. And in a sense, really what that was like that sense of being on an apprenticeship continuing, because Richard is the most fantastic classical designer. He's got the most incredible, very personal way of designing and detailing and proportioning classical architecture. So I was really learning from somebody who really, really knew and had really figured things out. And we had great fun the whole time. It was hard work, but it was amazing. I was working on a lot of fantastic projects where we were some new houses, but mainly I was working on restoration, actually, of some beautiful houses in Greenwich Village, and doing up really fantastic, brownstones down in West 11th Street and Bank Street and Charles Street. It was great fun, and it was the most amazing time. So that was 5 very happy years of my life. And you can see at this stage, I'm now, I guess, sort of in my very early 30s. I'm sort of 31 or something, 32. And I adored living in New York. I still love New York. I love America. It's just the best country in the world. And, sometimes you need to be reminded of that, because everyone's kind of doom and gloom these days. But it's just great, and we need that sense of optimism and opportunity that I think America offers. And but there was this sort of weird tipping point then for me of, okay, do I stay here forever? I was beginning to actually settle into life quite.
Right.
I loved it there so much. I had so many great friends. I actually started to apply for a green card and to go through that process. There was a whole moment which was, talk about poignancy, and I think I write about this a little bit in the book about actually watching one of the planes go into one of the Twin Towers, the second plane, obviously, and with my own eyes.
Yeah.
And that was a pretty grueling time for New York, and it definitely took an edge off things in a way for us all. I think living there, particularly living downtown, it was very present. And maybe that was a little wee tipping point. But actually, in a way, it was more, I just actually started to feel homesick. I started to feel homesick for my family, and I started to feel homesick for England, for I suppose that rather idyllic idea of the English countryside. And I missed green winters. One of the things about living in nice, mild,
that's true. Gosh,
temperate, rainy England, where it never gets that cold. We might get snow for a few days, but it goes, and it's never that cold. Is that even in the midst of winter, the whole countryside goes black and grey and steely, and brown, but fundamentally it's green, because we live in this grazed grass landscape, and I really miss that, because the American winter is actually,
it's pretty bleak.
It's dry and it's desiccated, and it's brown without any green.
Yeah.
It's got the green of little.
Oh gosh, and especially New York. There's so few trees to begin with, and then
Yeah,
they all
you're
lose their
right.
leaves.
This is it. And so anyway, so then it was just one of those moments, and it was like, right, it's time to come home. And I did. I moved back. That was in 2003. And I can remember that date as well very distinctly, because I left New York, really bad timing, on the night of the Halloween parade in the village.
Yeah. Like I'll never make my flight.
Yeah. Leaving my flat, kind of in a taxi, trying to get to Newark Airport, and kind of thinking, am I ever going to make it? And I was like, tears were kind of like streaming down my face, because I was so sad at leaving all my friends and my life, but I'd made this decision, and then I was kind of surrounded by crazies,
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's a sort of potted history, and then that takes us up to almost 20 years ago. I then came back to London, and the Prince's Institute of Architecture, his architectural college, had sort of morphed by then, a few years later, into more of a architectural charity pressure group, which handled all of His Royal Highness's very broad interests in the built environment. That is really what first led me down to Poundbury, the Prince's town in Dorchester, which obviously I've now worked on a lot. But we were working all over the country on a huge, wonderful kind of variety of projects, ranging from, one of my favorite projects was a self-build project with young kids in Birmingham, building their own community centre. And some of them were kind of 13, 14, 16 years old. And I was helping a team help them design and build this fantastic community youth centre, which is still there and very much loved and used. And that's a really wonderful kind of project to work on. Some of them were very small, very individual things to do with buildings where the Prince of Wales was fundraising for building projects, and we were brought in to help advise the architects on kind of what was happening or what they should be looking at and thinking about. And some of them obviously with these broad, large-scale urban design projects. And I worked there for a while, and I was doing little bits of design work on the side for people. And there was suddenly a sort of moment, which I do write about, which was again one of those little funny key moments in life, deciding moments, where I'd done some house design for a housing developer in Poundbury, in fact, a little kind of design for some terraced houses. And then the following year, they said, oh, well, now we're doing the rest of it. And they're basically the same. So we're going to give you a little repeat fee for these houses. You'd already done them, but we're going to pay you a little bit more. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. Didn't expect that. And suddenly I had enough money in the bank to pay rent, my little flat rent, for 2 or 3 months. And I thought, wow, I could actually, go out on my own now. So I did. I just decided. So I told everyone, and that was all fine. And so that was 2004. And that's a 20-year journey from now and it was the summer of 2004 that I set up on my own. So then the rest is history.
Yeah.
It's the book. I'm going to stop talking for a minute, let you ask a question.
I found it so interesting, when you were talking earlier about someone telling you that you couldn't do it and building into designing whole towns. I mean, what an arc. And then, but I was really struck by Poundbury and the town in Scotland you're working on, because you were talking about repetition and simple gestures and building something and sort of realizing you say this much more eloquently in the book. So maybe you can repeat it, but like
I think everyone in the world, everyone in the Western world, or the kind of the developed world and the developing world, let's not forget, the vast pressures on development in Africa, and the intensely rapid urbanization of places that is happening everywhere now, or Asia. But in our world, the world that I live in, the world that the world of American post Second World War to the current day, that sort of 70-year span, 80-year span of development, fundamentally, we all live completely, inevitably. There's nothing we can do about it now. There are things, but there's not a lot we can do about it now. We live in a world that has been designed for better or for worse. I mean, when it was done at the time, it was with good intention. But then, as I often say, the road to hell is paved with good intention. We live in a world that is completely inexorably designed purely around private cars
Mm-hmm.
to move around. And that single fact has kind of shaped all of our development patterns and structures, and frankly, our entire way of life now for 30 or 40, 50 years. And I suppose that it was actually not that long after we, as a society, invented capitalist suburban sprawl, if you want to call it that, as a system, and then perfected it in the 80s and the 90s and the noughties. It wasn't long after the invention of this type of development, entirely based around cars, often based around demolition of old and historic places or their degradation and their replacement with new sprawl kind of further out from the center of this. So the hollowing out of old towns and cities, which we've all witnessed. By the late 70s or 80s, there was a very strong movement beginning to develop in both the architectural conservation world, saying it's just simply not right to knock down swathes of old parts of cities because the street width is inconvenient for 6-lane motorways to kind of pass through. This is not this is not something we can do. And obviously in Britain and in America, that happened on a massive scale in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and into the 90s. I mean, Glasgow, one of the great Scottish cities, they were completing their inner city motorway network like really quite late into the end of the 20th century, into the 21st century, which is shocking when you really think about what was going on. And then equally, there was a sort of growing network of thinkers and writers, polemicists. Leon Krier is the master planner of Poundbury. In America, you have Andres Duani of the fantastic master planning firm practice DPZ, based in Florida. Andres and Leon knew each other well. They had met. They were sharing similar philosophies. They're by no means the only two. In America, there was this very early kind of development of a whole extended now a very huge group of people called the Congress for the New Urbanism, the CNU, which was devoted to kind of understanding different ways of building patterns of development. And basically what Leon in England, he's the one I really know. He's the master planner of Poundbury. He met Prince Charles in the early 80s. And that's another whole long story, but they hit it off. And Leon was ultimately commissioned to design this large new housing scheme that the Prince of Wales was planning on the edge of a town in Dorset in the west of England called Dorchester. And the Prince of Wales has this huge landowning organisation called the Duchy of Cornwall, which is a very historic estate. It was set up in the 14th century to give an independent income to the heir to the throne. It was sort of like designed to avoid arguments between the king and his son, which has been pretty successful over the centuries. Yeah. And so when you are Prince of Wales, when you're waiting to become the monarch, you have this huge independent estate, nothing to do with the crown estate or with the monarch's wealth. It's entirely the Prince of Wales's project. Obviously, Prince William is the new Prince of Wales, and he's now inherited that, and he's actually bringing in his own fantastic interests, which are very respectful of his father's interests, but a bit different. He's really interested in the challenge of homelessness in this country, and he's now trying to work out, how his landowning organization can help provide solutions to sort out the challenge of homelessness. For instance, it's a different narrative, but it's all part of the same bigger picture. He's also highly interested, as is his father, in sustainability, and obviously the king, the former Prince of Wales, when he started talking about a lot of the things that he was talking about where our food is coming from, about how land is farmed, about patterns of development. When he was first talking about this in the 1980s, he was widely ridiculed by huge sections of the so-called intelligentsia, the so-called design elite, just thought that he was backward-looking and completely ridiculous.
Isn't that fascinating?
And obviously, the deep irony is that now, with the benefit of hindsight, it's absolutely fascinating going back to his early speeches. I mean, he was giving speeches in the 1970s when he was in his 20s about plastic in oceans, plastic pollution in ocean. You know, it's like, I'd like to
Right. He was dismissed.
some of the great modernist architects and what they were talking about then. So anyway, so Prince Charles had been approached by the local town council or the regional council in Dorset, saying, "Okay, we need more land for housing on our county town, Dorchester, on the edge, please. And your estate owns all the land." Now, historically, every time more housing was needed, a request was put in from Dorset County Council to the Duchy of Cornwall, and another huge parcel of land would just get sold, and suburban housing estates got built all over it, you know, any time from 1930 to the 1980s. And the Prince was getting into architecture in a big way. It's what led to his architectural school. He wrote a brilliant, he did a TV program, which is fascinating. You can still, your listeners can still watch it on YouTube. It's called A Vision of Britain. My title is not a director of half of that book and TV show. It lays out, and you can buy the book. It's everywhere. It's a secondhand book now. It's not published, but it's really widely available on Abe Books or secondhand book dealers, because it was very, very widely printed and read at the time. And it's very influential. It's got a lot of interesting ideas. It's fascinating to read it, because a lot of what he was talking about has now really come to pass in a much bigger way now.
Yeah, he was before his time, I guess you would say.
I really do believe that. I really do. And you know, people can say what they like, but the sort of the proof of the pudding is in the eating, is a little expression which comes. You know, he really has walked the. He's been on that journey for an incredibly long time. Leon. Obviously he is an academic, he is an architect, he's a designer, he's an urban planner, and he is also what's called a polemicist. Like, he's somebody who in the 70s and early 80s was intentionally kind of winding up the kind of, you know, trying to pinprick the pomposity of the modernist architectural experiment, and equally understanding how structures of settlements and how we move around is just it's far more fundamental than what buildings look like, actually, as to how we kind of all live. But obviously how buildings look like is really important as well. So Leon got the commission to master plan Poundbury. It set off in the early 90s. I've been involved there now for a long time, for the last 15 years, pretty seriously. And in the next few years, probably 2 or 3 years' time, the development will complete. It's got 2,500 houses in it, so it's got about 7,500, 8,000 people living in it. So it's a very major extension to the town of Dorchester. But unlike all of those suburban sprawl examples that we can see everywhere in the world, wherever we go, Leon's plan has delivered. And it's actually delivered. It's there on the ground. It's the most amazing place to visit if people find themselves.
It's beautiful.
In the south of England. It's fascinating. And it has a lot of visitors now, all around. People from all around the world are coming every year. Tens of thousands of visitors, urban designers, students, architects. Like, it's fantastic. So Leon designed the whole place around a series of small, walkable neighborhoods. So the whole point is that if you live in a house, you should have all of your daily needs. So not everything you need in your entire life, but your daily needs. So that it's like a food shop, maybe a post office, cafe, a pharmacy, doctor. I mean, hopefully you're not going to the doctor every day, but those sorts of things, the dentist, the hairdresser, those sorts of things, restaurants, your daily needs within a 5 to 10 minute walk of every single house. So every single house in Poundbury is planned around a whole series of little designed neighborhoods, which have got pubs, shops, cafes, restaurants, offices, and so on and so forth, all clustered in amongst the development. And into that, we've also built employment space. So obviously all of those shops and cafes and businesses are employing people. But then we've built commercial office spaces. So there's lots of people who've got their solicitor's office, or whatever the company might be. So some of these businesses are public. Anybody can walk in there, like a shop or a cafe, and then some of them are just commercial offices. But they're all dotted in amongst the whole development. And now there are 2,500 houses. There's something like, I can't quite remember the numbers, but it's about 2,800 people work every day in the town, in this little village, the town extension, the urban extension that Leon has designed. So there's more than one job for every single house. Now, not everybody who lives in Poundbury works in Poundbury. That would be pretty crazy and unusual. But actually about 30% of people who work in Poundbury do live in Poundbury. So then those people are actually able to walk to work every single day. So we've designed a new place where every single day people can actually just walk to work. And this is not like living in a city. Like if you live in, a city or a downtown district or, a historic place, yeah, you expect that part of the quality of life. It's part of why you don't have, countryside surrounding you. It's you live in a dense place where you can leave your flat or your apartment or your house and you can walk to where you work. One of the great pleasures, or get on a bus or like simple public transport. But in Poundbury, this is a brand new place where we've achieved that. It's completely revolutionary and amazing. Then one of the fascinating parts about it was very much the inspiration of the Prince of Wales, the former Prince of Wales, although the new Prince of Wales is even more into this, which is incorporating social housing, so affordable housing, what used to be called in England council housing, where people on a housing needs list, for whatever reason, they're on the housing needs list. And we've had this long tradition in Britain of providing the government providing high quality housing for those people to live in. As the 20th century progressed, it went on quite a rocky road, and that's a whole history which we can't get into here. But one of the things which was happening in Britain in the 1990s is that developers were segregating off that contribution that they were obliged legally to make and saying, well, we don't want those people here. We want to build very private, fancy houses, blah, blah, blah. And the Prince, meanwhile, was visiting huge numbers of places where it was all social housing. And that can in itself create its own problems because, again, we don't need to go into that now, but you can imagine kind of like if you take a lot of people who are possibly struggling a little bit in life for whatever reason, which is why they've been given a subsidized, affordable government house, it's not necessarily the best idea to put all of those people right in one spot each other, particularly if I can say a lot of the time, because it was government designed projects, modernist architects in the 60s and 70s had a field day kind of doing their crazy architectural experiments with concrete or tower blocks or buildings which are, potentially quite dystopian. Because the people occupying those houses had no choice about the style of house. Whereas if you're buying a private house, you've got a degree of agency over where you live. But if you're being given a house, you don't have any agency over what it looks like. So there was a lot of experimentation going on.
I hadn't considered that before.
Yeah, and it's the same in the United States as well. And so the Prince's solution to this was that he felt very strongly on a personal level that the social and affordable housing provision should be sort of invisibly pepper potted through the development as a whole. We use this expression pepper pot. So it's just dotted in each street, in every single street, in every single block of housing, a proportion of it, about 30, 40%, a proportion of it is low cost housing. And then the remaining balance is private market housing. And the private developers who were building the private houses sort of said, oh my God, it'll never work. We'll never sell a house next door to a council house. Guess what? We've sold 2,500. Well, we've sold 1,800 of them.
Whatever 60% is. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Whatever 60% is, exactly. Very, very successfully. And the housing providers, the registered housing providers who provide all of this social housing thought that they were going to be in a complete mess where they couldn't manage it all. Guess what? If you give people a really nice house, this is a bit simplistic, but if you give people a really nice house, really well built, nicely designed, in a street where it's absolutely indistinguishable from the private housing next door. The interesting thing is that in Poundbury, the evidence, very clear evidence there, is that all of that housing needs far less management than equivalent estates elsewhere. And, there are all sorts of reasons as to why that might be, but it's a very, very powerful statistic. So that's a massive game changer. And obviously, the other thing which wraps into it is that we did this thing where nearly all development, I mean, this is especially true in America, but it's true here as well in England. All developers like to build just for a single type of person. So you have a lot of estates in your country which are gated executive homes estates. And they have got like a whole series of giant houses. They're all like the same demographic. They're all big houses with the same sort of people all living around a big cul-de-sac in the middle. And then you've got starter home developments, which is for the young couples who are starting home. And you've got senior living for people in, the later years of their life. And, that's all true, seniors. And, we do this in England as well. Developers are very good at trying to build almost a single type of house for a single type of person on quite a large scale sometimes.
It's efficiency, I suppose, but...
Huge. Well, they think they know their perfect market. And so that's all they're interested in. They don't like range. So you have golf club developments, or you have kind of like starter home developments, or whatever it might be. And what they've done in Poundbury, this is Leon, is just every street has got a mix. So it's got flats, it's got apartments. Those apartments might suit very young people, or if we put lifts in, they'll work really well for older people. We've got small houses with gardens. We've got big detached houses. We've got a whole range from small to large all through the development, so that realistically, if your life circumstances change, like you have an extra kid or you kind of want to downsize or whatever it is, you can actually live your whole life without having to leave the development. If you chose not to. Obviously, you can go anywhere you like. But so often planning today forces people to then move from one side of town to the other side of town because they've gone up in the world, they've got more money. So then the fancy house is kind of 3 miles away from their old friends and neighbors. So all the time, all of these tiny little things are to do with like how we build, how we create places which build community. And actually, really what we're trying to do is just learn our lessons from how great places functioned in the past. But still, you know what? You can actually have a car. You can make sure you can park it. Yes, you can have like bathrooms and kind of modern conveniences. Just because your house looks old, or just because it's designed in a way that, respects local patterns of development, you're not trying to kind of banish modern technologies. They're perfectly sensible. Why wouldn't we have like energy efficient heating? Because sometimes people say, oh, well, you're designing as a traditional architect. Well, you need to be kind of walking around, how dare you use an iPhone or AirPods or a laptop type of thing.
That is interesting. I hadn't thought about how the urban planning, or I suppose lack thereof, really, I guess you just don't really think of how it impacts the smaller elements of your life. And also, you think of it maybe if it's like a bad traffic light or something, or, but.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's really interesting. So then the development in Scotland, Tornagrain, which is sort of like the next generation from Poundbury, it's one of my favorite projects, is that is a really large new place, 6,000 houses, being built to the east of Inverness by an aristocratic estate. The Earl of Murray is the landowner. And he's a fantastic guy. He's a tiny bit older than me. We're such close friends now. We've worked together on that project for so long. But he had a similar vision. He was being approached by the local council, who wanted to come up with plans for very large new housing developments where he lived. It's a very beautiful part of Scotland up in the northeast, just outside of Inverness. And he felt pretty troubled by it was well-intentioned, but he felt quite troubled by what he was hearing. And so he hired Andres Duani from Miami, the other master planner who I mentioned earlier, to do the strategic master plan for Tornagrain. And then my firm, we've been involved all the way through, which is now about 18 years ago that we started. And then my firm has now taken that on in much more detail, like with the detailed town planners and architects. And it's just, you can see all the pictures in the book.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
We're not really allowed to have favorite projects, but it's kind of my favorite project.
And that's our show. You can find all of the show notes on our blog, howtodecorate.com/podcast.
To send in a decorating dilemma, email your questions to podcast@ballarddesigns.net so we can help you with your space.
And of course, be sure to follow us on social media at Ballard Designs.
Don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. And please leave us a review. We'd love to hear your feedback.
Until next time, happy
Happy
decorating!